We're going to do a super video. We're going to strip down one of these UDRs completely, every nut and bolt, or almost every nut and bolt. This is a used UDR, not sure what condition it's in, but strap in, get some beers, get some biscuits, get a couple of cups of coffee, and watch and see what you think. Here we go. First things first, body shell off, that's easy enough. Tyres off. You'll see the car is sitting on a very used but one of our 3D printed stands. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take off this bottom plate and the protection plate. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take the rear trailing arm assembly off, undo the prop shaft and the top and bottom mounts and also the shock mounts. Now to get to our mounting for the top control arms, I've actually got to remove these panels. So to keep it all symmetrical, I'm going to remove all these panels now as well. Now we can get to our top control arm mount. Then we just need to remove our limit straps and our roll bar mount. And there is the rear assembly off the truck. We won't strip that down anymore at the moment. We'll get some other big bits off the truck and then work on these bits individually. Next thing we'll do while we've got the truck upside down is we will have the front assembly off. So we'll remove these 4 screws here and we've got 2 more down there to remove. What I'm going to also remove is the servo link before I turn the car back over. To remove the front of the car, I've actually got to remove the shock assembly. So to make it all easy and straightforward, I'm going to remove all 8 shock absorbers now. So to remove the fronts, we've got to remove some of these screws on here to let this forward part hinge forward. If you've seen a previous video, we did do a video on replacing these side bits and actually removing the front assembly of the car, so you can watch them, which gives you more details on how to do it. That then hinges forward and you've got 2 long screws there to remove. Shocks then drop down, and on this car we've actually got alloy front lower arms, so these just unscrew. On the standard truck they're slightly different. You have to just remove the top half of the wishbone to get it out. That's the front shock, and that is our shocks removed. Don't get them mixed up, they're actually different lengths, or the additional dampers are different lengths. See, the ones on the front are actually shorter, so don't get them mixed up. We'll keep them over there. We've got the others over there. So now we're going to just remove this front end. Just got to remove some of these bolts. Front of there then comes off. What we then need to do is we actually need to remove the top wishbone mounts. Pull the pins out. Then we have 4 bolts in here. Then our front end just drops away like that. So the next thing I'm going to take is I'm going to take out the centre transmission. We haven't actually got a speed controller in this car, so it makes it a little easier to get it out. So I'm now going to take out the battery tray, or the battery retaining system. And there is our centre transmission out. Motor wires are already disconnected. You would just need to disconnect the motor wires if you had them connected to your ESC. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to take the side chassis rail off. Multiple screws just to undo, and then that lifts off easy enough. There is a screw in the middle of that, which you need to just make a small slip to get that off. So there is all the screws removed, and one of the rails is now off the truck. We'll do the same on the other side. As you can see, the truck is now starting to come to bits quite quickly. Taking off the other side has actually freed up that part. Just lay that there. And there we have our other side rail. You see the car is pretty much, well, it's fallen to bits on me now. So we have the rear panel and the shock mount parts. We then have the front parts of the chassis. Put the front over there. There's the driver moulding. We'll put that with the body shell. Just remove this rear light bar. We'll just remove the high voltage LED controller. We haven't actually got front LEDs on this truck, I don't think. So we'll put them, in fact no, we'll put them with the body parts. The only other thing really to take off this now, I've already undone the servo from underneath. We would normally have the speed controller in here, but so I haven't got that on here at the moment. When we rebuild the truck, I will put that back on. Pass that through there. And there is our servo. Standard Traxxas one. So that is, all intents and purposes, the truck will be in part of rather big parts in pieces. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to take some of these bits away. I'm just going to clean some of the plastic parts up just with some wipes, a little bit of water. Then we'll look at some of the bigger parts like the front and rear and the middle transmission and the shock absorbers. The car completely stripped down. I've removed a few more pieces from the chassis rails. We've separated these parts. I've also removed the receiver box. I hadn't actually removed the receiver because that was stuck in and there's no point removing that. To remove the aerial goes in there, and there's actually a little grub screw that goes in there which you just need to undo. You can see it, hopefully you can see it there on the workbench. I've basically given all these parts, started to give them a good clean up with just some wipes, degreaser if there's a bit of grease. You can use things like ultrasonic cleaners, and just to give you an idea, that's just wiping down, started to wipe down the chassis there. So that's what it looks like at the moment, and that's what it's going to look like when I've finished wiping over that. We've still just got a couple of bits of the battery retaining system in. I think they're the only bits I'm actually not going to bother to remove. I mean, you could actually put this in something like a dishwasher if you wanted, but just make sure you've got no screws left in it because it does need to be completely dry. Obviously we've still got the battery retaining part there in it, but I'm not going to bother to remove them, I don't think. So we're just going to go away, give all these plastic bits a good clean up, then we can start putting the chassis back together, and then we can start looking at the actual drivetrain components. So we've given this a reasonable clean. It's going to get dirty again, but it just does clean up quite nicely. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to get as much bits back on this truck before I look at things like the transmission, so we've got less parts laying about. So the first thing I'm going to put back on is this radio box. Now you need to make sure when you put your lid back on this radio box that you get this rubber seal in the right place, because that's what gives it its waterproof properties. This is not waterproof, it's the box that it's in is waterproof, and again you need to make sure you get your wires coming at it correctly. So that just goes on there like that. And here is the little grub screw which we were talking about. You see the cable tucks round there like that and then goes into there. But this could come out, not really too lightly with these trucks, but what we do, we just have that little grub screw just goes in there and it just stops the aerial coming out. Then we'll just put back on the battery block. So there we are, that's that bit back together. Put that to one side. I'm just going to put these side parts on here just to start with. Just put that on, if we get it the right way around, just going to put that on there, so we've left a screw in there so we know which one goes in there. So we've got that back together. And lastly, I should have put this back on, to be honest, when I was putting the chassis back together, but that bit, no, it doesn't go on that way, it goes on that way. Just on there like that, and then we'll just put those two screws into there. So there we go, we'll put those bits back on. It just gives us a few more bits together to, or less bits to lose, shall we say. Right, so what we'll do now is we'll just start to get some of this cage together. It does get a little bit complicated around here where these shock brackets go on. They go on around there, and it gets a little bit complicated just working out for them, but we'll just get some of the cage together so it's sort of holding itself together a little bit more. As you may have noticed, we didn't actually have the cross brace in here. That's obviously somewhere else. I need to put that on the car, but we'll get a few of the bolts in and we'll see how we get on. Now, some of you have noticed I have actually put this on the wrong way around, so these are the joys of putting the car together for the first time, and I obviously haven't referred back to the manual, but we'll just swap that round. So that's now in the right way around, and we can carry on getting some of these points fixed onto the car. So what we've done, I've fixed all the logical points in. We've fixed that one, two there that actually go into the main part of the chassis. Got the brace across there as well. I've also fixed the back part in. It's amazing actually how flexible this is. So until you actually get it all built up, you know, you get the triangulation of all the chassis parts, it does actually work pretty well. So I'm going to put the other side on now. I'm not going to do some of these bolts up completely tight because I've got to work out and get these parts back on round the back there. So, but I'm going to put these on so I've got a car that doesn't fall to bits on me. So we've now got a car that's starting to resemble something like the UDR. And it's amazing just by putting those few more screws in how much it stiffens the car up. Just need to be aware some of these screws are different lengths. You've got a longer one where it goes through more than one part of the chassis. They're slightly longer. Still got top ones to put in there. One of the things I do just want to check is I think I was probably missing some screws out of these front towers at the front here. So I need to just check that and see when I get back to that part. So now we're going to look at putting in these rear cross members. This part here. Work out which way that goes in. So these are handed. They go in this way round. In fact, they've got the numbers on, not the numbers, the letters on there. It's got an L and an R on there. So we know this one goes on the left of the truck. It goes on there like that. It hooks into the smaller part at the bottom. And then this one goes the same on this side. So this is the only bit really you've just got to be a little bit aware of when you're doing it. And then this part, these long screws go through there. And then the next longest ones, they go through these top bits. So there we have, back part on. You'll see I've actually left those screws loose because I actually want to give it a bit more space. You'll see later on just to get the bits into there. So that's a fair few bits gone off our bench here. Can't really do too much more. So what I'm going to do now is we'll now look at the transmissions on their own. So we can now set this aside. So as you're going to start with the centre transmission, I've just given it a little bit of a clean up. You can actually do all this on the truck. You don't need to take it off the truck, but obviously as we've got this far, we will continue and give it a good strip down. We're going to completely degrease it and rebuild it. So the first thing to do is 2 screws to remove this cover. That will then enable us to be able to remove the motor. That cover then removes off, and there's not too much grease in there, but we'll still clean that up, and we are left with our motor. Now to remove the motor, got 3 bolts here, 2.5mm hex head bolts these are. Just remove all 3 of those. Those 3 bolts removed, so with these 3 bolts removed, the motor should, just slacken that one off completely, the motor should then come out. We've got 3 bolts. Note they're different lengths. The longer one goes in this side. And there is our motor. Some people put grease on these, you don't need to. As it's a steel pinion onto the spur, I never bother with that. And the other thing to make you note of is when you put your pinion on, the grub screw needs to tighten up against that flat on there. If you don't do that, it will come undone. It's not a lot of maintenance you can do on these motors. The only thing really you can do is oil the bearings, but we're not going to worry about that. The motor feels fine. If you look on one of the other videos, I did show how to replace the actual rotor on a brushless motor, and it's the same principle for any brushless motor. So that, just a little bit of a clean up. As a note, you can mesh the pinion on this manually, or you can use the pin where it automatically meshes it. So we'll just leave it as that. And I won't cover what goes where, but that's easily findable on the internet as to what pinion and spur gear you have. You have to make sure that's in the right pin. So we're left with our centre transmission. We've got these bolts, all these bolts just need to come undone. So I've removed all the screws. Just be aware they are different lengths. You've got longer ones, the front here, the longest ones go in the front, and then actually the shortest ones go in the back here. Just need to be careful of that. So we'll lift off our cover. Now that's not too bad, that's not too dirty. Some of these are absolutely encased in grease and oil, and that's just not needed. But we will give that a good clean. So we just lift out our centre transmission. The centre diff, here is our centre diff. The diff oil in these is so heavy that you won't probably be able to turn it by hand. And this is our front drive. We're going to take this to bits and give this a nice good clean. So that's those 4 screws out of there, and this all then just lifts off. And that's actually quite dry. That's actually, I expected there to be much more grease in there than that. We have actually got an upgraded front centre drive system on this, but it's the same principle if you've got the standard one. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove these bearings. Don't want to degrease the bearings, so we'll remove the bearings, and then we will put these into degreaser to get the worst of the grease off. So we've given this all a really good clean up. As you can see, this has come up really well. It's really nice and clean. We've also checked all the bearings. They all feel good. You need to make sure, because if any of these bearings feel notchy or graunchy, replace them or give them a good clean, because it will fail. And also check that all your gears are okay. These all look fine. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to put the centre or the front part of the transmission together. We've actually got the upgraded centre front drive shaft, but it will work the same whichever one you're using. So that just goes on there, and I'm actually going to put a small amount of thread lock on here because we've got metal into metal, and the last thing you want is this coming undone, because it won't be the easiest thing to get back to when your car's back together. Small amount of thread lock. Of course, what we've got to put on, the bearing. Bearing needs to go in there, so make sure we put the bearing on. Otherwise that would have been a bit annoying. Tighten that up. That's not coming undone. Next thing, got the 4 bearings to go in these recesses. And a slightly larger bearing in the middle, like so. Gears then go on the side. Like so. Obviously I am going to put grease in this, but I just want to make it up dry to start with. That goes on there. That bearing goes in the centre. We have the outer ring that goes on there like that. a little fiddly, and then goes on there like that, and that then sits over there like so. Now it is dry, but let's just see if that feels okay. Yep, that feels good. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put some grease in here. Now I just use multi-purpose lithium grease. This is actually a wheel bearing grease. We'll put some of that in these parts of the transmission. Don't want to put too much in here. This is obviously going to get messy. What I'm going to do, I think that's enough to start with. I'll just put a small amount around this centre gear. There we go. Pull away some of the excess. And then we'll just nip it up with these 4 screws. So we'll tighten them up, just clean away some of that excess grease on there, because we don't need any grease on those bits. Just give that a turn and hear all the grease, but that feels nice and smooth. So we'll now start to reassemble this centre transmission. So we need the centre transmission assembles like that, and then this wants to be at the top because there's a recess for the bottom one to go in there, and then that then sits in there like that. We'll check that all runs freely. Yeah, that's all good. And then the last bit to put together is this. Now I'm just going to put a small amount of grease on here. Now the reason for that is this actually moves in and out of there, so you just want a little bit of grease. They're the only 2 parts in here really need greasing, is that bit and there. Obviously you've got the grease in the centre diff, but they're the only parts that need. You don't need to put oodles in there. Pop these bearings on, and then don't forget the seals. Now the seals sit in that little slot there, so yes, we have to remove this there. Perfect, that goes in like that. Here, to put the cover back on first before we put the motor on. So the cover just sits on like that. Make sure it seats all the way around. You'll hear it just click. Again, just spin it to make sure it feels all free. Now you have got slightly different length screws on the transmission on this cover. You've got a slightly longer one at the front here, as you can see it has to go all the way down to the bottom there, so make sure you don't get the wrong length screws. In fact, that one is not the right length, it's that one that goes in there. You want to make sure you get these right, because otherwise your transmission won't be very strong. So we've got that back together. I'm not going to put the motor in, I'm actually going to put it back into the chassis next. So here's the chassis. It just sits in there like so. 4 bolts, all the same length. And we'll just snug those 4 bolts up. So there we go, that's in the car. Every stage I just give it a quick check to see it actually moves. It won't be very free because it's quite a big piece of transmission, but it should be smooth and not notchy. So we're going to put the motor in now. Remember, make sure you've got your pins set correctly. We'll feed the motor wires through a little gap there, and that should just sit on there like that. Three motor bolts. The longest one goes through this side. You've got one there and then one down there. They are slotted, these holes, so that you can adjust the mesh depending on your gear and spur gear. But of course, if you use the pins, you don't need to worry about that. So we've got the transmission back in, and just to clarify, it actually takes 1 million weight in the centre diff. It's actually almost like a paste. It's quite strange. So we're just going to put this cover back on. Simple task that is. And then just 2 12mm screws to fix that in. There we go. That is the centre transmission done. We can put that to one side. Now we're going to look at the front end. So we'll just strip it down, have a look at the bearings and the likes. Drive shafts, they're important, they did get quite a lot of wear, and then we'll see what we've got. So step one, remove these front retainers. Then we can pull off this front plate. One pin, 2 pin. We literally almost got our front drive shaft assemblies and everything off. All I'm going to do is just remove the steering arms. There we then have our sort of 3 parts. So there are 6 bolts to remove the front diff. There's 2 larger ones and then there's 4 smaller ones. Remove those 6 screws, the diff just pops out. And what mess have we got in here? There's our, oh yes, there's a fair amount of grease in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove the steering as well. Just 2 bolts here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give this a good clean up again. Remove all this grease, and then we'll remove the grease from some of this, and then we'll just strip down the diff, see what the gears are like inside it. Strip down the diff, we've got to remove the drive cups, which are in here, which are 2mm just use the other driver just to help to stop that turning. There's your little 2mm bolt. That then comes off like that. Again, we'll check all the bearings. You can see they're as greasy as anything, so we'll give them a good clean up. And lastly, we've got these 4 bolts to see what our diff's like. So there we go, that's off. And actually that looks not too bad in there, but we will give that a good clean up so we can have a real good look at the check the teeth and everything. And the last bit, we'll just undo that nut in there, bolt in there I should say. Well, I'll get it right, it's a grub screw on there, isn't it? Undo that. Like that. That then pulls off. Again, take the bearings off. 2 different size bearings. You see that everything's covered in grease on this. And we are now going to go away and give this a really good clean. Degrease it, clean it up, and then see what we have got. So we've given this a really good clean and good degrease. You can see these parts have come up pretty well. Still got a bit of dirt in there, but I'm not going to worry about that. It's mainly got rid of the grease off these parts. We've inspected all these gears and they all look really good. Same with these ones and same with our pinion gear there. Now the only bits I haven't degreased is these rubbers which go on here and the seal that goes around there. You just don't want to degrease that because that will cause you problems in the assembly with the bearings. So I'm going to refill this. I'm going to put 30k oil in it. I'm not actually going to record this bit because I've already done a video on doing this, so there's no point really duplicating that. If you want to look at that video, I'll put a link in the description. I'll try and put a link on the video here. But we're back in a minute with this all built up and ready to go. So here's the front gearbox all back together, all greased up, and I'm just about to put it back together. The steering is now about to go on, but just be aware you need to take this cup off. You can't get the steering on with that drive cup on, so we just took that off. Sure, when you tighten them up, you're not pinching the steering. So I've done that up, good hand tight, and that steering's still smooth, and I will do the same on this side. So there we go, we have the steering back on. That's nice and free, and there's no play in that. We'll just put this drive cup back on now. Already put a small amount of thread lock on that, stop that coming off. And that is our front transmission ready to go back in the car. Now we'll have a look at the front suspension. The two halves here. What I'm going to do first of all, just feel if those bearings feel good. That one feels okay, this one feels a bit graunchy. So what we'll do, we'll work on this one first and we'll strip it down. So the first thing we can do is we take the nut off. This just comes straight off. Here is the drive shaft, just pushes out. The bearings come off with it. And I'm not going to cover again the drive shafts because we've already done a video on that, and again I'll leave a description for that. Or sorry, link in the description for that, and you can see what we do. But in essence, we just put a small amount of grease in there. But let's have a look at that bearing. That bearing actually feels a little bit graunchy. Let's pull that off there. The outer one, yeah, neither of them feel very good. So I think we'll probably replace those bearings. And then we'll have a look at these suspension parts. Do they feel free? That's free in there. But we will just take them off just so we can see what we've got. So we've given everything a good clean. But one of the things we have noticed, we've got these Vitavon lovely, rather heavy front lower wishbones. But both of them, we've got actually a bent screw in there. So we actually can't remove it very easily. So that's a thing to bear in mind if you're running alloy things. I think if this had been plastic, that wouldn't have happened, but that's your fail point or the weak point on these when you have these wishbones on there. So in actual fact, what we're going to do, we're going to add this to the list of parts that we're going to buy new. We're going to get a new set of these. I'm also going to get some new bearings as well, because I'm not particularly happy with the bearings on the front wheels, relatively cheap. And also I'm going to get some new pins for the drive shafts, just to make it a little bit better. But I'm going to put the whole car back together, because I then haven't got too many parts laying about, and then we'll make a list of items to put to order so we can get the car back together properly in the end. First thing, we'll just pop the drive shafts back through the hubs. Pin goes through there. Axle goes on like that, and we'll put the nut on there so it doesn't come off. Then got our top wishbone. Just make sure we've got the right ones here. Yeah, that's right and that's right. Put the steering link in first. As you say, we've got alloy Vitavon steering links. The plastic ones do tend to bend a little bit, but again, plastic bends, it gives. This will, it won't give anything. So you like this to break your mounting points rather than actually any bending when you get a big accident. So there is our, what's that, the right hand side front corner together, and we just now do the same with the left. So here we go, we've got our two front corners together. We're now going to put them onto the front gearbox mounting. Just worth checking that they still run freely, they do. And what you'll see, I've also just tightened those nuts up all the way so that these hexes don't slide off and you lose a little pin out of there, which is a possibility. With these shafts, give them a roll, check they're straight. If they're bent, replace them. You never straighten them out properly. There's no point even trying on that. So we've got this, goes on there like so. Pin through the front. Same on the other side. We then have our metal bracket that goes on there, and then the retainer to stop those pins coming out. Just those two screws there. And that is the front end ready to go back on the truck. So here we go, we've got the truck back on the table, and we're now going to put this on here. Now the trickiest part is actually to make sure this goes into here and into there. So is that located? feel it, there's resistance. That's moving, so that has located. We'll get our 3D printed stand. Then got our 4 bolts that go in there. You've got 2 longer ones at the back and 2 shorter ones at the front. We can then turn the truck over and we can just put in 2 screws that go in there. I'm not going to mount the servo in just as yet. I'll come back to that in a minute. So we've got it into the front end. Ha! So the front end is now back on the truck. What we need to do is just get some of these parts mounted on it just to make things easier. So first things first, put the top links on. You just have these covers that then go over these to stop these pins falling out when you're running. Like so. Now you may have noticed this truck didn't actually have a front sway bar or anti-roll bar on it, so we haven't got to worry about fitting that. If you were, you could now fit that at this point, and it then fits in those mounting points there. Now this part's a bit fiddly. I probably should have done this before I put this on, but we're just going to attach the front track rods for the steering. So I haven't actually put the servo in just yet. Line that up. Screw should drop down there. And there we have the majority of the front end back together on this. What I would normally do now, I didn't put the shocks on, but I haven't rebuilt the shocks as yet. So I'm going to leave the rest of that. I'm actually now going to look at the rear end. Now this is the part that takes the most bashing on these trucks. It's quite exposed. It's a locked rear axle, so I expect there to be quite a bit of wear on here. We might need to replace some bearings and that, but we'll get it stripped down and see what we've got. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pull all the, I'll take these nuts off, take off the hexers, the pins there as well so we don't lose them. Then I'm just going to take off all these arms. So took all the arms off, also took the prop shaft off. Yes, that is pretty worn, but I tend to run that till it breaks. They're easy enough to replace and they're relatively cheap. Have got some different ones of them to try. So here's our axle. What we're going to do, we're going to strip this down and get it to bits. Basically all the screws have got to come undone. So we removed all the screws from there. Also removed these 2 screws each side of here, and also sometimes these horrible brake calipers on there, I don't bother to use them. Take off the retaining parts. The axle should then pull out. Let's have a quick check of that bearing. That bearing's fine, as is that one. Now we should be able to remove it. So there we go. There is our rear locked axle, spool, whatever you want to call it. Diff, it's not really a diff. Doesn't look very greasy, so we'll give that a good clean up. But first of all, we will just take, what else we've got to take off on this? There's only a couple more bits to take off on this, which is that screw there and that screw there. And these stiffener braces come off like that, and that is all one moulding. So that needs a bit of a clean, so that can go over there. And then to get the rest of this apart, there is, well, we've got 4 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4 to undo. Those 4 screws are removed. Those 4 screws are removed, and you should then be able to split the 2 halves of the rear casing. One bit to pay particular attention to is this front bearing. It sits right in here and it's very exposed. I've had one of them fail before, but that one feels okay, so give that a good check. So we'll have this to bits, and like we did on the front and centre, we'll give it all a good clean and degrease. So we've cleaned everything up, it's all come up pretty well. Checked all the bearings are all good. So we're going to just put together the rear spool assembly, or the rear locked axle. Now this is the same gear as what goes on the front. The only thing is, make sure you don't throw this away if you ever replace it, because this is the adapter that means that you can use it on the back rather than the front. So it's very simple. That goes on there. Then we have the 4 bolts over here. Make sure you put a little bit of thread lock on these, because you don't want these coming undone, and it is metal into metal. So I'm just going to put a little bit of thread lock on all of these 4 bolts, and then we will just put them into there. So we've got those 4 bolts in there, and you've got this little plastic adapter bit here which just goes on there, which when we get this back together, that just sits in there like that. Check that, that's spinning nicely. So what we need to do now is we need to put together the Planetary gear system. I've already checked all the bearings in this, they're all fine, all good. So just a simple case of putting in all the gears. Feels okay. That then goes over there like that, and that then sits on top of there. It's exactly the same as the one that's for the front, which is actually in the centre transmission as it happens. So what we're going to do now, we're just going to take that off, and we'll just put a bit of grease in there. So we've put a decent amount of grease in there, and we've screwed up those 4 bolts there. It's now ready to have our pinion gear on there. That goes on there, and so that then goes on the front of there. Most important bearing in the car, in my opinion. That's the one that's most likely to fail in your car. So it then just slides into the housing. That bearing just slides forward like so. Now what I'm check that fits okay. There we go. And that is the gearbox in there. I'm just going to take this back off and just put some grease in there. You can just put it on the back there, but I want to get some right in there, so we'll just put some grease in there. Now I have put a generous amount of grease in there, probably a little bit more than what I would put in the front, but it does get a lot of abuse on the back of the car. So that now feels good. And all we need to do now, we've got 4 screws that go into there to hold that bit together. So we've got all those 4 screws done up. Now it's a case of putting it back into a housing. Now you can only put this in one way. You see you've got to stop a bit there to stop you putting it in the wrong way, so your wheels would go the wrong way around. So that just goes in there like that. And more of these screws. Fortunately, all of these are the same size, so there's no case of worrying about getting these around the wrong way. Screws done up. Got to put the axles in here now. Now some people, even around here, they'll put a bead of grease, or even pack some of this in here with grease to try and stop the dirt and dust getting in. I'm not a massive fan of that. I think it probably causes as many problems as what it solves, so I prefer just regular maintenance. So one axle goes in there. I've already checked these bearings, they're all good. If there was any problem with them, I just replace them for the sake of how much they are. And then we actually need to put these bits on first. So we'll just put them on there. We've only got 2 screws to go in here because the other 2 are used to mount the protection skid plate. The protection skid plate goes on there like that. We put these bearing supports on. We're now just going to put the protection plate on. This one's actually spaced off a fraction with these 2 spacers here, which makes it slightly trickier to get it on. Protection plates on. These are a good little bit of a kit to keep this axle protected. Just need to be careful. We have had one instance where this actually caught on something and bent all the way up, but that's all okay at the moment. So what we're going to do now is just going to attach all these arms back onto it. Now these are all standard, and these are probably one of the weaker parts on the truck. but we will just go with what we've got. And lastly, we've got these arms. You need to make sure you get them on the right way round. That is on the outside because that's where the screw holes go. And what you can do to actually make these a little strong, you can actually fill these with hot glue. Two last steps is to put the drive hexes back on. So, and then our last step, what we're going to do back here is put our drive or our prop shaft, whatever you want to call it, on there. Now make sure you do thread lock this. It does have a habit of coming undone, but also if you're using a standard one, make sure this head is really good, because if it's a little bit start to round off, you won't get the thing back out. We've had that before where they're a little bit difficult to get in and out. They can, if you haven't got a good, well, a 1.5mm driver, then they will start to round off. So we'll just put that in there. And there is our rear axle ready to go back on the truck. So we're now going to put this axle, rear axle assembly, back on the truck. First thing I'm going to do is actually put the rear drive shaft on. Now, similarly to when we put the other end of this on, I have just put a small amount of thread lock on there, because you can't actually get to this part with this cover on. Then it's just a case of putting in the lower mounting arms. And if you remember, we didn't actually put these screws through to hold the side chassis together. We then have the top control arms, and there's actually 3 different mounting points for those. But in all honesty, on a truck like this, it doesn't really make we've found much difference, so I'm just going to put it in the top mounting point. Anyone spotted a deliberate mistake here? We've got that one upside down. So we'll just swap that around. Then obviously we've got the limit straps to go on and the roll bar mounts, which I haven't actually got them on the car at the moment. But the next stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the shock absorbers. I'm going to rebuild those, but I'm not actually going to show that in this video because we've done a good video on that elsewhere on the channel. I'll put a link to that onto how to rebuild these. So we've given the shocks a clean, a rebuild. Bear in mind they are different front to back, so don't get them mixed up. So we've got a simple process now of putting the front ones back on. So I've mounted one side already, and then on this side, hopefully you can see, you've got this long screw which goes through your mounting point. You put the damper unit or the damp unit in first. Screw should then pass through that, and then behind that you then have your complete shock absorber unit, and then this screw passes through both and does up. We then have to mount the bottom part. Just need to line up the ball joints so they sit in these grooves. It's a little fiddly. And there we have both the front shocks mounted. Now we just need to turn our attention to the rear. So I've actually already put one side of the rear shocks on, as you can see. And then we'll show you how the other side goes on. We've actually already got these bump stops, these additional bump stop things on there, which we will leave on there. Now your longer piston goes on, and the shock goes on the front. So the shock then goes exactly the same way on the front. Now the top actually mounts in with the wing, as you can see on the other side here, or the rear piston only, and bounce onto the wing. So the shock absorber goes in there like that. Do when you're mounting the piston is it actually mounts through this hole here, through your the little number fin. So push that up like that. That goes all the way through there. It also fixes through there, as you can see on the other side hopefully. And that is our suspension mounted back on the car. What I'll also do now while we're looking at the back of the car is we will put on the anti-roll bar, or anti-sway bar, some people may know it as. It just passes through there. Of course, if you put it on the right way around, it always helps. Goes in from that way. See, those flats go on there to limit the actual downwards movement. You've also got your limit straps which help to do that, like that. This arm, which we'll put on this side. And once we've got this on, the last bit we've got to do is connect up the drop links for this, which we've already connected up to the axle. Already on there. And we'll do the same with the other side. So we're now just going to put on the remaining parts of the front bumper. You've got to sort of jigger it about to get it in here. We have 2 bolts going through there and there. We then have 2 more mounting points here, which we just need to tease it into. So we've got those back bits on. Turn the car upside down. We will then put on our brace on. The longer bolts go in the back, short ones go in the front. If you mess it up and put the short ones in the front, you'll screw it into the gearbox. And while I've got the truck upside down, I'm going to put the servo back in. This cable needs to pass through that slot there. So the servo mounts in there with just 2 screws. And then lastly, we just need to install the servo arm into the steering system. This is perhaps a little fiddly. Truck upside down. We will put in the battery tray, also a battery retaining system, and we could actually then, if we wanted, put on the underneath. I'm just going to leave that as one of my last tasks. Battery tray in. In fact, no, we will put this on now, and that's done and out of the way. On like that. Then have a copious amount of screws to go in. So there we actually have, I did put the battery cover, or sorry, the under tray back on the car. Last thing, put the battery cover on. No, we've got no batteries in it, but that just tidies that up and we don't lose that. And that is almost everything I think we need to do underneath the truck. So we've got a few jobs now to do on top. First one is to plug the servo in. Channel 1 is steering. There's actually 2 channel 1s on these. They're usually the ones right at the bottom there. So that's going to go in there nicely. We will also now put the high voltage lighting system back on it. So the first part, so that is the front light bar. We'll put the control box in first, which just sits on these mounted parts here. You can change the modes obviously on this if you want to. Then we have our rear light bar, which goes on the back there. So that's our light bar in. We just need to tidy up some of these cables. What I'm actually going to do now is I'm actually going to put on these panels. That's just another job then done. Some people paint them. I just like them as they are. So here we are with the truck finished, pretty much. The only thing I've got to do, put the wheels on and a body shell on. Now, it's been a long video, I know that. Now, just as a matter of interest, there's a few things I haven't done on this. I haven't actually fixed an ESC in it. I've covered it up with this. I haven't put the crossbar in, and I haven't mounted this on. And I also haven't put the battery cover on because I haven't put the speed controller in. So, if you have got this far in the video, just put a comment in the description, just with one of those items that I haven't done, just as a matter of interest, because I don't think many people will get this far in this video. Wheels on, body shell on, and then it can go on the shelf. There we have it, all done.